right, we're back for episode 7.3. This one all about God and guns. This one about faith and firearms. What should we do? How should we think about the Second Amendment? A follow up to our previous episode, 7.2, that was on, I'm sorry, 7.1 was the First Amendment, so free speech. And the next one was about capitalism and Christian charity. Was there a dichotomy there? So you can check those videos out if you care to see my opinion about those things. This one, 7.3, is all about firearms, the Second Amendment, and what should we do with that constitutional right to own and bear arms. And so I'm gonna start this episode. I'm gonna try to keep it fairly short, so I do have some notes I'll be looking at. Forgive me for looking over to the side to do that every now and again. That's just to keep me on track so that I don't make this a 40-minute video. Certainly, after I've been done talking for about 5 minutes, probably anything useful I had to say has already been said, and I'm probably just rambling at that point. So we'll get right into it. So I will approach this politically, philosophically, the way that I've approached each of the other episodes having to do with my political opinions. And this mini series, 7.1, 7.2, 7.3, this is all about my political opinions that um, you know, might seem extreme or controversial or whatever else. I don't think any of them are. I think most of my positions will be traditional ones. Most of them will be opinions that have been held for a long time. And so I'm a fairly traditional guy. I describe myself as a libertarian. So I start freedom first, liberty first. But as I find myself in that camp of people that love freedom and focus on the Constitution, I am a conservative leaning libertarian. So for my own personal way of expressing those beliefs is going to be informed primarily by my faith, and so that my faith leads me to believe that conservative principles are the more biblical ones, the more in keeping with I think the Christian ethos. Now, I understand that people are wanting just me saying that people wanting to jump in the comments about social justice and things. Again, I don't. You can do that. You're free to comment and say some things. I believe that Christian morality is better reflected by conservative talking points than it is by liberal ones. That doesn't mean that isn't a veneer of Christian garb that sort of these things are dressed up with, things like social justice and stuff like that. But I am convinced that social justice and a conservative viewpoint are not opposed to each other. It's you know what's the best good we can offer people, and how do we get there? We're going to differ on how that plays out, and people tend to polarize into left or right, and then they'll use the Bible, or that's how they see the Bible as those verses jump out at those that are on the left or right, and they see everything else through the lens of those verses. But when it comes to this one, the Bible doesn't talk about guns. The Bible just doesn't talk about guns. So we're going to get into what I believe how the Bible might inform what I believe about this topic. But I'll start from the libertarian perspective. So I'm a constitutionalist. I think the freedoms are first and foremost when it comes to how a people should be governed, particularly in a land that was, founded upon freedom first. As a mindset, departing from a place where the freedoms were limited, and so this was a hallmark of the Constitution, was that freedoms matter. Then, of course, the amendments that came in, the Bill of Rights that came in not long after the Constitution was written, to sort of secure and solidify those most important freedoms. So I start as libertarian. I start as somebody who believes that freedom is important, liberty is important, and that we should start there, and that your freedoms should only be limited to the extent to which they might infringe upon somebody else's. And so we kind of would take a self-governing, uh, a self-governing aspect to that, um, and and I think that we should be self-governing individuals, responsible not only to do what we should do, but be mindful that we're not the only ones here, and take care of our neighbors, love our neighbors as well. And so I think your freedom should extend up until the maximal, distance up until they start to infringe upon mine or somebody else's freedom, and that's where I would limit them. So Second Amendment, no different. Now, the Second Amendment, the right to keep and bear arms, um, a lot of people will push back on this and say, well, wait a second. When this Constitution was written and when the Bill of Rights was written, we're talking 18th century. We're talking about more primitive weapons. We're talking about pea shooters compared to what the what is available today. Uh, and and they might concede that the Second Amendment was written to protect against the potential of a tyrannical government. But today they would argue, some people would argue that, well, since we don't have access to like Tomahawk missiles and tanks and things like that, is it really even fair? Is it really even isn't it sort of a moot point that you can have your handgun or your your semi-automatic weapon or your even your AR-15? Isn't that a bit of a moot point when the government has tanks? Well, I would say a couple things. I would say, first of all, if a tyrannical government was to rise up, hopefully that would be the tyranny would be you know represented by relatively few people. Um, Against which an armed citizenry would actually be able to quite easily stop that, because a few tyrannical politicians are not going to have access to the entirety of the modern weaponry of the army, the armed forces. So those that would say, you know, do away with your Second Amendment rights because it doesn't even do you any good anymore, because of what the government has at their disposal. Um, well, I would say, well, why would we take away what little we have then? If that is the case, and we have pea shooters compared to their Abrams tanks and things like that, why would you take what limited availability, what limited ability we have to resist a tyrannical government potentially? Why would you take that away? If for no other reason than just the symbolic sort of nature of it, that yeah, keep and bear arms, the ones that you're limited to having and possessing. Um, but, I would say it's a kind of a nonsense argument because, I do think a well-armed, citizenry that is trying to stop, uh, a tyrannical government from rising up, would very much be capable of thwarting that uprising, if they had even basic firearms. There's a lot of us. I mean, there's a lot of people in this country, over 300 million people, and most of us love freedom. And so I think that's kind of a nonsense argument to throw out. Um, but then others would say, well, we need stricter gun laws on the books. We need to curb those freedoms because firearms are too available and they're too easy to get, and things like that. I would willing honestly, I'd be willing to hear those arguments a little bit more readily, if I ever heard one that I thought might be obeyed by those that are willing to do bad things with firearms. And so the idea being, and it's a fairly common sense one, the idea being that, if a person is going to commit the atrocity of taking somebody else's life, for instance, it's like the most sacred thing you can violate is being willing to snuff out somebody else's life, somebody else's existence. I think if you're willing to go that far, there's no law on the books or no law that could be on the books that would prevent you from doing what you are intent on doing. If your conscience isn't bothered by taking someone's life, it's certainly not going to be bothered by breaking a few laws in route to getting there. It's like stepping over a dollar to pick up a dime, to think that, oh man, I would have loved to take that person out, except this law is in my way and it's stopping me from doing it. I just don't think it's the mindset. And I'm not trying to caricature this. I really drop your comments if you have an idea for legislation that you think, you know, answers that challenge. I'm all ears and I'd love to hear it because I love good ideas and I'd love to discuss that with you. And so if you think guns are too readily available and you have an idea of how that could be curbed, then drop that in a comment below. But I would also say that be mindful of this: that if you're the law that you would create is going to unarm the law-abiding part of the population, then would you not concede that all you're effectively doing is taking the guns out of the people's hands who weren't going to do those atrocious things anyway? I mean, think about it. If somebody is mindful of not disobeying the law, they are, which is to say that they're going to obey the law. They're likely to obey the law. And if there is a law that says, "Hey, you have to give up your firearms, you have to give up your weapons, you have to give up your guns," um, the segment of the society that's more likely to do that is the group who's also not likely to commit those crimes with those guns. And so this is maybe an old and tired argument, but I've never heard a good response to it. And I'm all ears. I would love to have that back and forth with you in the comments, or even just a conversation. For those of you that know me personally, I'd be happy to talk. But I think all you do effectively is unarm, disarm the population, um, from being able to defend itself against those that would do it, that do them harm. And so I think that's unfair. Secondly, or in addition, because I don't know what point I'm on right now, but in addition, I would say, we think about law enforcement. Maybe just law enforcement needs the guns. Maybe nobody but law enforcement needs guns. But you think about when do police usually show up? And this is not a knock on police officers. I know a number of police officers, respect them, respect the profession. They have a hard job, and for the most part, they do an excellent and honorable job at what they do. But my contention is this: when the police are called, generally it's not because a crime is about to happen, it's because a crime already has happened and the damage has already been done. And so the good guys showing up with a gun in that instance is really just to investigate what crime already happened, what person was already harmed. You limit the taking the guns away from the people, limits their ability to thwart that crime from happening in the first place, and maybe stopping it, in its progress. So I think there's more common sense on the side of um, freedom when it comes to firearms. With those checks and balances, we already have a number of laws on the books. But my question is for those that would differ with me: which additional law do you think you would write? Which bill should be written and turned into law that you think would actually work, and why do you think that it would work? It would be my question. I don't think additional gun laws myself are going to be effective, but all ears for hearing about it. The second, so I want to bring in now, that's my political perspective on this. But as a Christian minister, as a pastor, shouldn't that color the way that I see guns in general? And shouldn't that maybe that should even limit my enthusiasm for firearms? And so I'll admit right out of the gate, it does. My Christian faith and what I believe the Bible calls us to be a people of peace and peacemaking and peace loving, be a unifying people. Yeah, I said at times to people having these conversations in person, I've said things like, "Man, I kind of wish guns could be disinvented." Now, that may seem extreme. I made my living for a number of years being a firearms instructor. And I've always had a healthy sort of respect for firearms. And I've never been a big gun guy. I've never been big into owning a lot of them. I do have some, but I've never been a big. I've never called myself a gun guy. And I do, in my honest moments, which are hopefully a lot, most of the time, I do kind of wish that guns could be disinvented. I see the great harm that is done. Firearms are first and foremost, sort of weapons of war. I mean, weapons of taking another person's life, which I think, we as Christians, people of faith, should never minimize the heaviness of that. That these things were made for uh, taking of life, or protecting of life. You look at the positive side of things. You'd rather use it in defense of, and maybe as a deterrent, and never have to pull a trigger. Well, I know a lot of police officers have gone through a whole career never drawing their weapon, and that's good. They probably live in decent neighborhoods, or work in decent neighborhoods. Um, but as a Christian, as a minister, I come pretty close to calling myself a pacifist. Now I have to parse that out. I have to nuance that a little bit because as a person who um, uses that label about myself, it does have limits. Now, I look at Matthew chapter 5, and it says, in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, he says, if somebody strikes you on the cheek, offer them the other also. And obviously, he's not just speaking literally, though I think it might be literal too. And there's no reason for me to think it shouldn't be taken literally, but I think it's broader than that, and he means for it to be broader than that. If somebody does you harm, be willing to be harmed again by them, and not have a retaliatory sort of perspective on all the evils that are done to you, not always looking to get even, but rather being wronged than to wrong somebody else. And so as it relates to my own willingness to defend myself, I tend to be a pacifist. Now, I'm not in every moment. I'm not a perfect pacifist, and I have a temper just like anybody else, and I can get pushed to a limit just like anybody else. And but my positional sort of stance, in peacetime, is that I want to be and want to live out life pretty much as a pacifist. Where I say that that has limits, and that's what I mentioned when I started this portion of it, the talk, is that it has limits in that um I don't think that I should be a pacifist when it comes to um, watching somebody else be hurt. Namely, as a father and a husband, my family comes to mind first, but my congregation. I mean, if somebody walked in and just started smacking folks like in the church, I wouldn't just be like, "Hey guys, just accept it," just turn the other cheek. That's for me to follow personally, but I'm not going to watch somebody um, just run around doing violence against people that I'm supposed to care for and protect and serve. So I would have a limit on that, certainly for my family and for those that I care about and love, and even those that I don't know. I think I have a duty and obligation to, as a man, to protect those that are less able to protect themselves. And so I would say there's a serious limit on that. Now, there's also passages in the Bible that talk about Jesus talks about tells his disciples to sell their cloak and get a sword. And I think people don't people have different explanations for what that means. But I'm not certain that I am 100% confident in what I think it means. But I tend to agree with this commentary. It says, when he said that, this explanation is that opposition to the disciples is rising, where before Jesus had sent them out empty-handed, yet they were provided for. You can see that and this I'm in Luke chapter 22. So this is Luke chapter 9 for these other passages it's referencing. Um, but he says now they will have to take provisions and protection for their travel. They will have to procure a sword. So the idea is that persecution may come, but maybe there's some value in not being unable to defend oneself. I think there's a certain deterrent with um, if somebody knows you have a sword or a knife or a gun on you, they're not as likely to mess with you. And so just like the police officer who never had to draw his service weapon, you may never have to employ it, but somebody knowing that you might have it on you could be a deterrent. And the disciples had a mission; they had a job to do, and it wasn't just go out and get killed for the faith. There was a period of time in the church where people would be too eager to become martyrs for the faith. It almost became stylish to become a martyr for the faith, and so there's some stories you can read about where people like they were like lining up to be martyrs, and that was, I think, the wrong approach because we have a mission. Maybe the chief thing we can think about when it comes to like what would I give up for my faith? Well, if I'd give up my life, that's everything. And so, what greater thing could I do to I guess exemplify that than to give up my very life for the faith? Um, and that's true, but we have a mission to do. I mean, we're supposed to. Our job is to preach the gospel, to make disciples of people, help other people follow Jesus, like we're following Jesus. And we're to do that until there's no longer breath in our lungs, and in so doing, Christianize the world, the right way, not through force, but through appeal, through being God's ambassadors, or ambassadors for Christ, as Paul talks about, I think in First or Second Corinthians. Correct me if I'm wrong. You can drop that in the chat if you know the verse, but we have a mission, and the disciples had a mission to be on, and that was to preach the gospel in their immediate vicinity. And Paul would go and spread that even further, and so they needed to not become martyrs overnight, or else their mission would have failed. Now, certainly, God would have called more people, more disciples, to go and do these things, but his um, sovereign will for these disciples to do that work. And so there's often a mix of God's sovereignty and sort of common sense approach to things. Um, we don't drive everywhere with our seatbelt off, saying, "Well, God will protect me. God will protect me." Yes, He can, He will, but He doesn't want us to be reckless about things either. And so there's a balance I think to be had there. But so I think there may be, there may be some parallels to Jesus telling the disciples to carry a sword, and the possibly the fact that the world is getting it seems to be getting to be a more dangerous place, especially if you believe certain things you're not allowed to believe, um, according to some. And so maybe there's a parallel of protection and preservation. But as a Christian, we all should look forward to. Here's an important distinction that I meant to make. It may be ideal, as I said a few minutes ago. I kind of wish guns could be disinvented. Maybe that's the ideal world I'd like to live in, but it's not the world that I actually live in. And so often, when you end up on one side of a spectrum or another, politically speaking, I think what often happens is people on one end actually believe that utopia is achievable, apart from Jesus returning and setting up His kingdom. Um, I don't think that it is. And so I want to live in the real world. You can kind of use the Matrix, the movie, as an example here. I would rather be aware of the reality around me rather than blissfully unaware that I'm in some experiment or some simulation. I want to live in the real world. In the real world, people get hurt, and good people that are able to defend those innocent people need to be able, willing, ready to do so. And so I want to live in the real world. But every Christian, with that said, every Christian should look forward to a time where guns would be completely unnecessary. Completely unnecessary. I'm looking at a passage in Isaiah. Let me share this again. But a passage in Isaiah chapter 2 and verse 4, where it says they will beat their swords into plowshares. And this is the idea here is that one day when God's kingdom is set up, and depending on what you believe about the millennial reign of Christ, maybe 1,000 years on earth when Christ is reigning, and these weapons and implementations or implements of war are turned into things that you plow the ground with. um and it's a very beautiful idea of the our future, a hope in Christ, that there'll be no need for weapons of any sort because there'll be no wars. There'll be no people hurting each other. And so this is our trajectory as people of faith, that we get to look forward to this. But we shouldn't take the idyllic sort of future state that only Jesus can usher in, and live as if that's the reality right now, because it's simply not. And maybe you're like me, maybe you say, I don't want to um I don't want to use violence to defend myself. And perhaps you're like me, the only time you might consider using violence is to protect somebody that you care about, an innocent bystander. Be that as it may, we all look forward to a time when Christ returns, and no violence of any kind is necessary. No self defense of any kind is necessary. But that day comes, until that day comes, for my part, and happy to continue this conversation with those that differ with me. But for my part, until that day comes, I believe that I have a job to do, a responsibility to protect and to defend those that are less able to protect and defend themselves. And so I'm going to continue in this broken world. I'm going to continue to be a supporter of the Second Amendment, even though I wish I lived in a world where it wasn't necessary. But that's all for this episode. Hope that you found it helpful, and look forward to having you join me in the next one next time around. God bless.